This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to You're Dead to Me, a history podcast for people who don't like history, or at least people who forgot to learn any at school. My name's Greg Jenner, I'm a public historian, author, and I'm the chief nerd on the BBC comedy show Horrible Histories. Do you fancy some funny with your facts? Then you have come to the right place. Every episode I am joined by an expert historian who is book smart, and a comedian who is joke smart. And today we are donning our bicorn hats, having a paddle across the English Channel, and spending some quality time with young Napoleon Bonaparte, looking at how he went from random Corsican teenager to top dog in Republican France. In History Corner, she's a lecturer in modern European history at Northumbria University. She's an expert on Napoleon's reputation and political cartoons. It is Dr. Laura O'Brien. Hi, Laura, how are you?
Hello.
And in Comedy Corner, he is a Renaissance man. He's a stand-up comedian, a writer, a radio producer, former QI elf, no pressure, and co-host of the international mega smash hit podcast, No Such Thing as a Fish. It is Dan Schreiber.
Hey.
Dan, thank you for joining us. You've just been on a ludicrous European tour with the podcast. Did you feel like Napoleon?
Well, I fortunately for this format know nothing about him, so I might have, but I didn't know it.
Dan, you basically don't know anything about Napoleon?
I've got the basics. I know, Waterloo. I know a few details about his life, Josephine, all that sort of stuff.
Cool.
But his early life, I know absolutely nothing about.
Well, that's today's episode. We are looking at the young Napoleon, basically him from small child up to about the age of 30 or so, when he becomes a very senior politician in France, but before he's the emperor. So that'll be another episode, another day.
So, what do you know?
We begin, as ever, with the So What Do You Know? This is the segment where I have a little guess on what you at home might think you know about Napoleon. And because we're looking at his youth, it's maybe not so much. So in pop culture, we think of Napoleon as a short man with a short temper. Depending on who you ask, he's either a hero or a tyrant. Either way, he is one of the most famous people in history, and certainly one of the most famous military commanders, a battlefield genius. Famous, of course, for losing at Trafalgar, losing at Waterloo, losing in Russia. Actually, I'm being a bit unfair, aren't I? Because he did win like 50 battles. His skill at war meant that he went from being the little corporal to Emperor of France in 1804. Oh, and yes, as Dan has mentioned, he had a wife called Josephine. Although, was she called Josephine? These are the things we might know about Napoleon, but is it true? Dr. Laura, as we've mentioned, Napoleon is a Corsican, which is sort of... Well, actually, what is Corsica? At the point that he's born, is it Italian? Is it French? Is it independent?
It's kind of a mix of everything. I mean, I think Corsica's island off the coast of France in the middle of the Mediterranean. It is technically, under the time of Napoleon's birth, technically under the control of the Republic of Genoa, or they call it the Republic of St. George, which is quite a formal name. But it is politically a very unstable place. When Napoleon is born... his father has just come out of supporting an attempted uprising.
Right.
Led by a guy called Pasquale Paoli. The Paulis are this dynasty of rebel leaders. But Carlo rapidly attaches himself to the French, who have taken over Corsica in 1768.
Okay, so he grows up Corsican, but there is a sort of French influence there. And his father is Carlo.
Yep.
His mother is Maria?
Maria Letizia, we usually call her Letizia.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're not called Bonaparte at this point, they're Bonaparte. Now, that's a terrible accent.
They're
I'm
Italian.
really sorry.
Right.
They're essentially Italian.
Bonaparte.
Napoleone Bonaparte. His uncle is Napoleone.
Napoleone Bonaparte.
Napoleone Bonaparte.
Sounds like an ice cream manufacturer.
Giuseppe. Yeah. This is awful. I'm just going to sound like Super Mario. So anyway, there's Giuseppe, there's Napoleone, and there's Maria Letizia, who is a formidable woman, supposedly the most beautiful woman on Corsica, has Napoleon when she's 19. Carlo... They get married, I think, when she's about 16, I think. Carlo is immediately packed off to Rome to study. I'm using inverted commas here, study. He studies having a good time.
Right.
And then he comes back to Corsica, but he does make it as a lawyer. Napoleon loves his mother. He remembers her very, very fondly. She was a disciplinarian and beat him up as a kid.
Oh, okay.
I've got this horrible story that would send sort of parenting experts into a spin, where he acted up at a mass in Ajaccio as a child. He would have been about 7 or 8, and he thought he got away with it, and she hadn't noticed. And the next day she said to him, "Oh, Napoleone, your uncle wants to take you out for the day. You better go change." So he skips off to his little room, and he's taking off his little pantaloons, I don't know. And at that point, as soon as she sees the trousers drop, she walks in and starts slapping him on the arse to punish him. She had let it sit and then she came in.
Brutal.
Yeah.
Is it a pick in your moment, though?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
why strike when you have to do so much sort of admin to get to the bum for the actual slap? I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying if I was going to slap a child's bum, my own son's,
let him prepare himself.
Let him take the trousers down.
But he still gets the shock.
Exactly.
It's horrible.
It's a sort of, it's good practice, I guess, for Napoleon's future invasions to sort of strike when it's least expected.
Well, they do say that his personality is very much Letitia's personality. I think he resents Carlo because they sent him to school in France as a child. He feels Carlo is a bit of a bootlicker. He's very embarrassed when Carlo comes to see him in school in about 1782, and Carlo is sort of kowtowing to all the priests who ran the school, and Napoleon's just like, get off. Oh, it's so embarrassing. But I think they did share some interest, because when Napoleon's in school in France, he becomes intensely Corsican and gets obsessed with Corsican identity and Corsica will be free, and asks his dad to send him books about Corsica, including James Boswell's History of Corsica, which had been translated and was really popular. So they share some traits, but I think he always felt Carlo was a bit feckless and had been unfair to Letizia and so on.
How far do they make it into his story? Do they make it to the end of this episode?
Oh, yeah. Letizia outlives him.
Does she?
Yeah. It's 1836. Carlo dies in 1785 of, we think, stomach cancer, which we think then killed Napoleon as well.
Okay.
Right.
So he's gone to school in France,
Yeah.
and this is military school, isn't it? He's not doing colouring in. He's presumably learning, war.
How to be a soldier man.
Yeah.
He's sent to a military academy at Brienne, which is not a cuddly environment. The idea that the French monarchy have this idea that they're terrible at war. So we need to toughen up our boys, and we need to not just have the idiots of the upper crust of the aristocracy coming through. So we need to be able to bring through the lower end of the aristocracy as well. And this is what the Bonapartes are. So he goes to this tough school, disciplined, but they didn't use corporal punishment. But they're learning about the art of war, they're learning how to be men, but they're also learning about the heroes of the past. They're studying the great strategies of Alexander the Great and Hannibal and Julius Caesar. And this is the environment that Napoleon lives in at the age of 9.
Is he a nice guy, age 9? Do we know?
He's a bit of a lonely boy.
Is he? So he's a bit sad, no
it's
mates.
a bit sad. And I mean, he probably did have, a couple of little pals. But I think he's a little boy that's been sent off to school in a country where he doesn't really speak the language. He's what they call an élève du roi, which is like a scholarship boy. And there's about 50 of them at the academy. But he kind of gets a bit bullied because people think Corsica is this crazy place where everyone's a bandit and a bit backwards. He feels a bit isolated. People took the mick out of his accent. And he probably was lonely.
Can you sympathise, Dan? Because you were born in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And then moved to Australia.
Yeah.
And then you came to Britain, where we all mock your accent.
Yeah, well, no one where I come from thinks I'm from there or believes that I'm from there. So if I say I'm Australian, Australians say you're not. And if I say I'm English, they say you're not. So I'm left with saying I'm Chinese, which I'm blatantly not. So I was actually more relating to that sort of in-between of not being the upper crust and not being lower.
Oh, okay.
But in a weird way, I was buying a belt the other day and I've discovered that I'm in between a large and an extra large. There's just one hole on the belt buckle that's missing that fits my size.
You need a Schreiber hole.
I need a sort of middle of large and extra large. I'm this weird gap in the shop, and I felt like, what am I? Who else has got this frame that they haven't made holes for?
So he graduates in 1785. He's done pretty well, but he's not like a sort of brilliant genius, is he?
You wouldn't have seen this guy coming out and been like a superstar in the making. He was, I think it's 42nd out of the 58 pupils who graduate from the École Militaire in Paris as commissioned officers.
Sort of mediocre.
How do you prove that you're the top of the war sort of chain when you're studying? Is it playing a lot of board games and winning Risk a lot?
They have sort of strategy tests and things like that.
But in war, you don't go, send the A+ first. There's no...
No. I mean, he proves himself with kind of skill. He goes to become an artillery officer. Yeah. So obviously he's trained in how to use equipment and stuff like that. He wanted to go into the Navy, but he hadn't done enough time at Brienne because the Navy was the sexy, glamorous branch of the French army. But then he couldn't go into that, so he went into the artillery instead.
Right. hate to say this because I know it's such a pop culture thing, but all I'm thinking is Alexander Hamilton's story of how he crossed over to America and he was from this place and he was a no one. And I have a feeling for the rest of this podcast I'm going to be bringing up Washington. And
I mean, he also fancies himself a bit of a writer. He writes a little bit of a novel.
Oh, he writes more than a little bit of a novel.
Well, he has a go at a Gothic novel, doesn't he?
He has a go at a Gothic novel.
Does he? Does it survive? Is it still in print?
I don't know.
Some of his writings do survive.
Yeah. I don't know if the novel survived.
I'm not sure if the novel survives. He wrote a lot. He read a lot. This is not a sort of gun-toting macho idiot. This is someone who's sort of an intellectual figure as much as he is.
He's a nerd.
He is a nerd.
Yeah.
He's a complete nerd.
Still a young man. France is not yet revolutionary. So he sort of goes back home to Corsica, does he?
He does a couple of postings in Nice and Auxonne. He goes back to Corsica quite a bit. Now, a lot of this is because of Carlo's death. So when Carlo dies in 1785, it's Napoleon, not Giuseppe, who becomes the de facto head of the family. Now, this kind of annoys Giuseppe. He's supposed to be training to be a priest. He does not become a priest. Spoiler. But Napoleon sort of becomes, and you can see the character traits of someone who takes stuff in hand, and he's sorting out the money, he's sorting out his siblings. He has a lot of younger siblings, some of whom he had never met when he went back to Corsica. Well, Laetitia had 8 children, so there were really young Bonapartes that he hadn't met until he came back.
So the French Revolution, Dan, you presumably know it starts 1789, but obviously the French Revolution takes quite a long time to really produce what we all famously think of, which is the execution of the king, Louis XVI. So how does Napoleon get sucked into this revolutionary fervour? I mean, is it a really slow burn where he very, very gradually rises up the ladder, or is there a moment where he suddenly, he's in there?
I'm in. Well, firstly, I think it's important to note that he likes the revolution. With his early letters, he is based in France in the summer of 1789. He does have to put down kind of popular uprisings, but he writes letters to his brothers where he talks about that the enemies, what he calls the enemies of liberty and the nation, are getting their comeuppance. What we do know is that having been educated alongside the upper ranks of the aristocracy, he thought the Ancien regime was a pile of nonsense, and therefore the upsetting of that order he felt was an opportunity for the nation, for him personally, of course, because it meant that he could rise up through the ranks really quickly, but also he felt for Corsica as well. But in time, he eventually starts to believe that Corsica is better being part of revolutionary France than being an independent state. He really comes to prominence between September and December 1793 at the siege of Toulon. Toulon has risen up against the Republic based in Paris. And the British who are fighting against France, as pretty much everybody is in 1793, have popped along to Toulon, because of course they have superior naval force, and destroyed quite a lot of the French fleet. So the French put Toulon under siege. Napoleon is dispatched there. He goes above the heads of the other commanders and says to the convention in Paris, these guys don't know what they're doing. Their tactics are terrible. Let me be in charge of the artillery. I'm going to move some light guns around and we're going to blow these Brits away.
So he's sitting on the subs bench and he's saying, put me in the game, boss. I've got this.
Exactly.
I've got this,
he is, that's what he's doing.
Or he's going to like a network party where it's just it's a book launch and he's just sidled up to the publisher going, I've written the real account of this. You need to drop this kid. It's interesting, isn't it, hearing the trajectory of these big characters, because in my head, he sort of just was, it must have been some sort of connection through wealth or whatever, but he's literally rising through the ranks.
He's only a captain, isn't he?
He's only a captain,
He's not senior at all. He's minor nobility, but not really.
He's not really,
The aristocracy have either been executed or they've done a runner, they've gone abroad, they're now joining armies to come attack France.
Yeah.
So Napoleon essentially is seizing the moment here, because actually there's not many talented soldiers out there.
It's an opportunity for actually talented people who don't have, not just the people who have the right dad, to rise up. But it is an opportunity, and he knows how to use that.
And Toulon is a great victory for him.
Yeah, the dispatches mention Dugommier quite a lot, who becomes a key general of the Revolutionary Wars. They mention him quite a lot, probably more than Napoleon. But the important point is that Napoleon is the one who makes the most of the opportunity, and Toulon is seen as his victory.
That's his breakthrough.
Yeah.
What was he bad at? He sounds really competent at everything. Are there accounts of him being like, after the victory, he pulled out the banjo and, mate, put it away?
He's not saying.
Yeah. What do we know much about sort of his flaws?
Brushing up on my first 30 years of Napoleon, there's no one like Napoleon to make you feel like the most underachieving person in the history of humanity. You're just going, and you're emperor. Well done, Napoleon. He's socially a bit awkward. He's not great you know, it's not like he goes into a room and opens the doors and everyone's like, oh, hey, Napoleon's here. It's kind of, do we really want to talk to this weirdo? He's described as being quite shabbily dressed. You get sort of reports in Paris about his hair being a bit straggly and not very well powdered, and he's very socially weird and a bit awkward. He's very intense. He has these kind of rapid infatuations with loads of women, and he sends them these kind of quite sad, I mean, I say sad in a kind of a pitying sense, love letters, or it's like, oh, I love you, please pay attention to me, and they're like, just please don't talk to me anymore.
It's emo.
Yeah, he is quite emo. I mean, he is like, there's something very
Gothic novels.
Young Napoleon is well emo. There's something really emo about him.
So you've mentioned the ladies. He's a sort of desperate romantic, but he's not particularly charismatic. But there is one woman who he meets in 1795, and immediately he's like, oh, this is the one. I love her so much. And she is called, Dan?
Josephine?
Yeah, she's not actually called Josephine.
Is she not?
So this is where it gets quite weird.
Yeah.
She's called Rose.
Okay.
So she's called Rose de Beauharnais. Laura, why does he call her Josephine?
This is a thing Napoleon does. It's really weird. He has a tendency to call people the names that they're not. Well, women. I don't know whether that's a control thing or what. So Josephine is Marie-Rose Joseph Taché de la Pagerie. Joseph is her dad. And he calls her Josephine. He loves giving people these little names. I don't know why. It's a bit weird.
It's a sort of daughter of Joseph. It's an honorary nickname.
Yeah, kind of.
I mean, I relate to that. It's very Australian.
Is it?
Yeah, you meet someone, you just give them a new name. There's not many Aussies you'll meet who won't call you by something else.
What would you call me, Dan? I mean, we've known each other for years, but what's...
the Gen Dog.
The Gen Dog?
Yeah, the Gregonator. You know, there's a number of things I would use before actually saying Greg. I'm just being formal on this podcast by calling you by your name. But yeah. But no, I don't see that as too weird. Did she then go, okay, I guess that's my new name?
She just fell in, I think, with that. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't think she was complaining when he started rising up through the ranks and being a superstar.
Yeah. To be honest, when you start meeting someone for the first time and they get your name wrong, if it's a boss or something, you think, it's going to be really inappropriate for me to correct. So if I'm just being called James now by this boss, I'll let him do it. That's my name now. What am I going to do? He's used it 7 times. I haven't said anything. It'd be rude.
Napoleon is giving other people nicknames.
Yes.
He's also got his own little nickname. He's known as the Little Corporal.
Le Petit Caporal, yeah.
That sounds like a slight insult.
Sometimes. I mean, there is this thing in French, as you know, there's a lot of, mon petit chou and mon petit and ma petite, and it's kind of an affectionate thing. But sometimes they are kind of sort of trying to make him diminutive. And
he's trying to be a sort of big, tough soldier, and people are going, oh, you're adorable. It's a little bit. It's
a little bit, yeah. I mean, like, this is, he, by the time he's met Josephine, he's even more of a star than he'd been before, because he's put down a royalist rebellion in Paris, and everyone's calling him General Vendémiaire, which is the month, the revolutionary calendar, that the revolt had happened in. I just would point out that it happened on Great Pumpkin Day in the revolutionary calendar, because the revolutionary calendar is named after fruit and veg, basically.
Best day of the year, Great Pumpkin Day.
Great Pumpkin Day. He has kind of become he's a bit more in Parisian society, and that's how he meets her, because she's, I don't know how to put this politely, a bit of a sort. It would be the politest way I can put this.
Okay.
She has a good time. Napoleon said she had, and again I quote, the prettiest little backside possible. This was after he met her. I don't think he'd actually seen the real thing at that point. Okay. He'd just seen it through clothes. Her husband got executed in the Terror. She's a survivor as well. She was imprisoned in the Terror, and her kids were taken away from her. But she gets them back when she's released. So there's Eugène and Hortense. And Hortense is not only the daughter-in-law or the stepdaughter of a French emperor, she also becomes the mother of a French emperor, because she marries Napoleon's brother, Louis, and they have a kid called Louis Napoleon.
It's very Mario Kart, isn't it?
Hey, Luigi, it's terrible. I'm sorry. Again, Italy, I'm so sorry.
It'd be great if in Mario Kart there's a code where you can unlock the entire
the Bonaparte clan. Yeah. You race as Napoleon or Luigi or Mario.
It's me, Gerolamo. That's Jerome.
So he's a little corporal. How little are we talking? We think of him as like this tiny little man, but he's not tiny, is he?
He's not that small. Really, I think the tininess thing, it's the English cartoonist Gilray's fault. He's compact. I think he's described as very tough. He's quite like wiry, certainly early on. I think we have this image of tubby Napoleon later on, and kind of balding. and a bit hair receding. And that's late Napoleon. Whereas at this point, he's very thin. But he's probably about 5'6", 7-ish, we think.
Which is sort of average height.
For the time, it's average height.
How tall are you, Dan?
I'm 6'1".
Yeah.
I've hung out with Brian Blessed a few times, and he is surprisingly smaller than
Is he?
what you would expect. Yeah, I think he's about 5'9", maybe?
Yeah, I'm 5'9".
5'9", but Brian Blessed, you get the impression of this ginormous character because of his personality, which is where you can, but it's only when you sort of look at him and you go, hang on, you're actually not 6'3".
Yeah. You're not this giant man stomping into a room.
Yeah, but he exudes the personality of a giant.
Yeah.
And
which I
Napoleon
imagine
must have done the
Napoleon
same.
would have. Yeah. Napoleon, he never had a box that he stood on when he was, I don't know, is that Tom Cruise? I'm confusing
That's Tom
him
Cruise,
with.
probably.
The stack heels is probably a Tom Cruise
Yeah.
thing, or a Bono thing.
But that was never a thing that he did himself.
Not to my knowledge, no. I don't think he needed shoe lifts. Don't think
Yeah, he was not particularly into his heels. He tends to wear little military shoes.
Little boots.
Boots.
Which were apparently terrible. Everyone mocked his boots. They weren't the right style for Directory Paris. The Directory is the regime that follows the terror. So Napoleon is very much an austerity kind of... I mean, obviously not always, as we can see in the amount of flounce he breaks out for the coronation.
Yeah.
But he has this kind of twofold image of like serious soldier, simplicity. I prefer to wear nice, normal, basic clothes. I'm not into the kind of flouncy fashion of the period. And this kind of gets him mocked.
The paintings that I've seen of him are all military gear. I can't picture him wearing, going to the beach, for example, or pajamas. I don't know what that style would be for him. But he was just rough and ready.
He was a bit early on. He was a bit rough and ready. I think Josephine probably sort of polished him up a little bit because she was like, "We're not going out if you're looking like that. That's not happening."
So let's talk a little bit about a couple of his big military victories. He gets given the army of Italy, which is a huge deal, and that goes very well for him. And then he's also given this sort of power to invade Austria, essentially.
Yeah.
So these are two big enemies, gone great for him. Militarily, he's proving himself.
Yeah.
But there's also, he's starting to use propaganda, isn't he?
Yeah.
Dan, if you were Napoleon at this point in late in the 1790s, what are you going to do to try and big up your brand?
I'm going to say I'm 6'1".
You are 6'1".
Oh, if I was
you were
playing
Napoleon,
myself,
yeah.
right, I'd come up with a logo.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'd come up with my Dan Schreiber logo. I would a range of merchandise.
Nice.
A lot of I'd seed a lot of sort of godlike truths about myself that were blatant lies. I would just hire people just to be like, God, that guy's cool. Just that, nothing more.
You just want your own hype man.
Yeah, exactly.
Dan's not far off the truth.
No, he's not.
there.
He's not far off it at all. He plays with news and he plays with the image really effectively. So off he pops to Italy. The army of Italy is in a bad way when he takes over, but he does really well. And he is rapidly starting to commission paintings of himself.
Selfies. Not quite selfies.
Do me a
but
painting, please.
Yeah.
He doesn't like posing for them. There's that painting of him on the bridge of Arcole, and it's this painting by a guy called Antoine Jean Gros, and it's the famous one. My husband always says he looks like Rod Stewart. And then he pays Gros, the artist, to get engravings made, so that obviously now everyone's going to have the painting, but you can buy a print.
Cool.
You can put it on your wall. And you can think about General Bonaparte, who's a legend. He has newspapers, some of which are for the army, some of which are for France, for his audience in Paris. There's a really clever thing, which is to put stories in about ordinary heroism. So reports about ordinary soldiers doing really good things. And also little stories about how ordinary soldiers think he is the business. So he's both playing on their kind of support for him, but also hyping himself up. So I think we would often assume he can only do this when he's the emperor, when he's in power. Really, he does this from the very beginning of his career. Certainly we see it in Toulon, but Italy is where he really gets good at this.
That's amazing. How many examples do we have of someone turning themselves into a poster for the bedroom walls of kids?
It's quite a common thing in the 18th century. So I'm writing a book at the moment on the history of celebrity, and
Right,
a lot of
okay.
actors like David Garrick did
Yeah.
exactly that.
He's a superstar, and I think and it's not just for France. This is the point where we start to see the reputation of General Bonaparte spreading across Europe as this liberating force. He becomes this kind of cultural figure of liberation, and there's songs about him, but we also see that in other parts of Europe as well. And so much of that is his own making.
If you were in charge of a bunch of soldiers, how are you going to get them on side? What would be your technique for winning over your men?
Holiday.
Yeah.
Good clothes.
Yes.
Good food. Good sleeping arrangements. Toilets.
Yeah. Gym membership.
Yeah. Netflix account.
Sure.
And pay, I guess, is a massive thing.
Well, that's a huge thing, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
He rewards talent.
Yeah.
And he invests in people that he trusts, doesn't he?
He cares. That sounds awful. Makes Napoleon sound like some terrible corporate shill. But he instigates a policy of paying them up front. So now they're getting paid on the regular. He also says, lads, you go over those Alps, what's over there? A load of riches and art and stuff you can have. So he's kind of promising the land of... It's not just promising stuff, though. He's also promising glory. You can be the son of I don't know, like a carpenter. That's a very Jesus reference, sorry. You can be the son of, a farmer from provincial France, and you can rise up through the ranks and you can become a Marshal of France.
European campaigns go really, really well. And then he's like, OK, North Africa, let's do this. And this is where he gets to sort of fanboy his own childhood loves, because Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great had both conquered Egypt. And in fact, Alexandria is named after Alexander the Great. And he is now leading this invasion force across the Mediterranean. He arrives, troops get off the ship, and then the British Navy turns up and destroys the French fleet. So it's got a bit wrong. That's called the Battle of the Nile, and that's Lord Nelson, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the first time they have their sort of encounter.
Yeah.
It's the first head-to-head.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do they meet?
I don't know.
It quite distant at that point?
Well, I think it's if you can imagine a kind of mental picture of like something in an Indiana Jones movie, those kind of maps they use where people are travelling across on planes, but boats floating around the Mediterranean. And Nelson is sort of saying, is he going to India? Is he going to the west? I think they're going to go to the east. Because the idea is that they've given up on the idea of an invasion of Britain at this point. They decide what we'll do is we'll try to cut off their route to India. Because if we cut off that, then the British won't be able to get their sort of money coming in from the Indian territories. So Nelson is following him around, essentially, and that's how they know where they're going to be.
Nelson wins a huge victory
at
the Battle of the Nile, which is where Nelson becomes famous the first time.
Yeah.
So Napoleon has had his fleet basically knackered behind him.
Fleet knackered. I mean, he has had some success. Like, he took Alexandria.
Yeah, so he's invaded Egypt fine.
Yeah, he's got there.
But he can't get home.
He's gone to Egypt. They've all thought this is going to be super cool and amazing. And they get there and they defeat the Mamelukes at the pyramids, Battle of the Pyramids. But they also have to deal with heat stroke, a lack of food, a lack of water, copious amounts of diarrhea.
Copious. You never want to hear that word, preceding diarrhea.
Not some diarrhea, Dan.
Copious. Because they thought, we'll live off the land. You get to Egypt, there is nothing to live off. So some of them went mad with heat stroke and killed themselves. It's terrible. And the ones that did find food found fruit, which they loaded up on. But of course, if you're not used to a fruity diet, you will get severe diarrhea.
Yes.
And that's what happened. And then some of them got eye infections. And it was like a really, really, really bad holiday. They had a terrible time.
One of the things that's most extraordinary about Napoleon, apart from all the military stuff, is that he brings across this hand-picked team of scientists and archaeologists and artists and engineers and people who are going to go and they're going to study Egyptology for the first time. And they find the Rosetta Stone. It's one of the things they do is
Napoleon found the Rosetta Stone.
They find the Rosetta Stone.
But really, without them, there wouldn't have been the modern foundation or the foundation of the modern study of Egyptology without Napoleon doing that. And he, as Greg said, he picked them by himself. He wanted to bring the scientific and intellectual expedition as well as the military expedition. So again, this is a sign of a man with considerable intellectual interests as well as military expertise.
This is incredible. And sounding more and more like an Indiana Jones movie.
Kind of is.
Rather. Yeah.
It's awesome. I mean, that's why it's a Frenchman who deciphers the Rosetta Stone later on as well.
Is it?
Champollion.
Champollion, yeah.
So Napoleon goes in, gets the Rosetta Stone, like
Isn't
Indy
it?
gets the golden skull, and
And
then
then Belloc takes it. And then,
bloody Nelson's out there.
It's amazing, yeah. And I mean, this is why you end up with treasures of Egypt in places like the Louvre as well.
Yeah.
Because they bring a lot of stuff back with them as well.
Yeah.
But he's not just, he's out there as a military commander and he's doing some nasty stuff too. He can be ruthless. If a city doesn't surrender straight away, he doesn't show much forgiveness, does he?
No. Some historians and some of his biographers, I think most notably, a kind of turning point in his personality. The famous one is Jaffa. It's technically now Israel, right?
I guess, yeah. I guess back then it would be known as the Levant, probably.
Yeah, it's sort of Syria, Palestine, but it's a town that surrenders, that they conquer, and then they go in and this is normal for the time. There's rape, pillage and murder for a couple of days. Now, the important point is that it went on for longer than normal.
Okay.
Then the garrison two of the French representatives go to negotiate with the garrison at Jaffa to negotiate surrender. One of these is Eugène de Beauharnais, who's Josephine's son from her first marriage. And they negotiate with the Jaffa garrison about surrender, several thousand men, and they surrender. And they've been told, we're just going to keep you as prisoners of war. When Napoleon sees the sight of thousands of prisoners coming towards him, now remember, it's not like they've got loads of supplies or the capacity necessarily to look after prisoners of war. And that's the point where he just goes into a rage and he says, what are you doing? What are you doing? How could you take these men? We can't keep them. And then you have further massacres when they are slaughtered. It's not unusual in the time because there's examples of Frederick the Great in Moravia. There's atrocities in the 7 Years' War. Everyone's at them. British East India Company conducts massacres in India in the 1790s and in Spain during the Peninsular Wars. But it's the fact that it's happening after surrender is seen as really problematic. So at this point, we see this ruthlessness starting to come through. Some of his biographers would argue this is a really rare loss of self-control on his part, that he loses it and just says, kill them all.
It's so interesting for me, who's not a historian, to see where the line is drawn on someone who's following the rules of war and stepping over the line. So every example you just gave, would biographers be seeing that as, okay, that's just the way it was? Everyone's a not nice person, but everyone's just playing by the rules. But now Napoleon, I can't like him as much as I did because it's so weird.
The problem is, of course, that he had kind of presented himself as this great, and I think he really believed this, a sort of liberator figure. He had also made lots of speeches about, it was terrible how people repressed uprisings in other parts of Europe and so on. And then, of course, he goes in and does something similar. Now, as I said, it remains a kind of a point of contention as to why this happened. Some more sympathetic biographers point out that he had just found out that Josephine was at it with someone else.
Cheating on him.
In France,
okay.
But, that's not an excuse, right? That's not, that doesn't mean, that's a bit of an overreaction.
Yeah. So he goes full Daenerys Targaryen.
He does,
he goes from being the kind of hero, everyone's like, oh yeah, we love Daenerys, to like, oh my God, you just set fire to a city.
Burn it down.
Yeah.
Burn it down.
Yeah. I mean, on top of that, if we've got an army that's being run by Napoleon who love him, who are seeing his guidance as the right way, it's not one person who's had a flip.
Yeah.
He's mentally flipping this entire army.
But he emerges out of this largely unscathed.
Yeah.
And he's lost his fleet. That's been a disaster.
Not that anyone in France knows that.
Sure.
Well, there are people in France who are like, yeah, guys, where are the boats?
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure we sent you with 20 boats, now there are 4 boats. But he now returns to France, leaving his army out there. I mean, he's sort of leaving the French Egyptologists still digging away. But he returns to France, and this is where he suddenly seizes power. So the coup is bloodless. But it is still a coup.
Yeah, I love Brumaire because it's campy and ridiculous in a lot of ways. The Directory is a 5-man team that runs France. There's a feeling that the government is fundamentally unstable, which it is, because they have royalists on one side and Jacobins on the other, and they don't know how to necessarily steer a course of moderation and order between these two extremes. So there are conspiracies going on. And some of the people who are thinking about this kind of need to stabilise power are people like Abbé Sieyès, who's a veteran revolutionary, Fouché, who becomes Napoleon's chief of police and has quite a brutal reputation as well. Napoleon has missed out on all the kind of down and dirties of Directory politics. So in a way, as you said, Greg, him being in Egypt is good. Because while it's a total mess, at the same time, at least he's not associated with political factions in France. So when these boys are plotting to put someone in, they decide, well, we want a military figure because then we can get the army on side. The plan is we'll get someone in, we'll have a bit of a sort of transition period, but then we'll be in charge. And obviously that's not what Napoleon did.
So he's meant to be a puppet.
Yeah, he's meant to be essentially a puppet. Now, so Napoleon returns in October 1799 to mega parties. There's lots of people throwing parties in his honour, celebrations, acclaim. There's a really naff play put on in Lyon called Return of Bonaparte to Lyon. So when the plot gets going, Napoleon starts to outmaneuver the civilian plotters. So we can start to see him making a move. 18th and 19th Brumaire, which is the 9th and 10th of November 1799, Napoleon's brother, Lucien, who is now the head of the Council of 500, which is like the House of Commons, the lower house of Parliament. Lucien starts spreading a rumour and telling the Council of 500 that there's a Jacobin plot against them. So he says, we all need to get out of Paris. We're going to go to Saint-Cloud, Chateau of Saint-Cloud, where it will be safe. Now, this was kind of standard fodder of conspiracies at the time, so they all went off to St. Cloud, and people probably had some inkling that something was going on. And the person they put in charge of the Parisian army is Napoleon, because we need stability and he's a hero. So anyway, when they get to St. Cloud, very theatrical situation. You need to also picture 500 men wearing togas over 18th century clothes. Jacques-Louis David, who is brilliant, he designs red togas that you wear over 18th century clothes and big hats with plumes. And Lucien Bonaparte trying to tell them, right, we need to restore order. And who do we need to do that? Guess who? This lad, my brother, conveniently enough. So Napoleon goes into the room. Lucien cannot control this at all. Shouting, screaming, people saying, down with the Caesar, down with Cromwell. Interesting. But they make a really big mistake because they say, right, we're going to talk about this, but we're all going to take some time now and individually swear allegiance to the Constitution of France. So that's 500 people having to say, I swear. Wow. And that is going to take hours. Yeah. Lucien has been lucky. So Napoleon, all the other plotters are a bit anxious about this. Napoleon is not a patient man. He pounces off to the Council of Elders, who are the upper house, and he goes in and does this really crappy speech where he says, remember, I march accompanied by the god of war and the god of fortune. He'd wheel that out in Cairo, which is fine on your troops. But the Council of Elders are sort of sitting there going, oh, what is this? Who are you?
I don't know, you figured that would work for a room full of toga wearing.
Yeah. Oh, the Council of Elders, I think, had a different costume.
Oh. What did they have?
Sort
of like Jedi outfits.
Yeah, they had quite tall, kind of feathery things. So Napoleon's back to the Council of 500. It's mental in there, still chaos. Lucien in the middle going, I don't know what I'm doing. They still start yelling about Caesar and tyrants. Some people try to physically attack him. Napoleon gets out, Lucien goes out and tries to get a bit of time, another debate, let's have another debate. At this point, they do this ridiculously theatrical scene where Lucien says, if my brother were to attack the Constitution of France, I would, and he takes out a sword to prove this, I would drive a dagger through his heart. And at this point, they're like, seems all right. And at this point, Napoleon then has military support to dissolve the chamber. And at that point, they then institute the consulate with 3 consuls, and Napoleon is, surprise, surprise, first consul. And the idea was that they would change around. Nah. Then he becomes first consul for life in 1802.
And then after that, emperor.
So
France has gone from having a king to ending up with an emperor. But that's for another episode. We haven't got time for that today. I mean, the only other important thing we talk about is Napoleon's penis, because that's what we've all come for.
Finally. So where is it?
Between his legs.
Okay.
Oh.
So the story is there's a thing called, well, actually, it's called Napoleon's item.
Oh.
Very euphemistic. And it's supposedly 1.5 inches long. It lives in New Jersey. A urologist bought it at a Paris auction for $3,000 and he's handed it down to his daughter. Bit weird. Have you ever handed down a... I know you've got a young son. I mean, would you...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what answer I could give that won't get me in huge amounts of trouble. But no, obviously not.
And you've never inherited
I've never inherited a pickled penis.
Suddenly that Boney M song's never going to sound the same.
Yeah.
But it is that sort of interesting thing that Napoleon, one of the most famous people in history, he's perhaps the greatest of all the military commanders of all time. But it's sort of odd that his body gets turned into this little relic, isn't it? It's almost like he's a saint or a celebrity. His penis, we don't know if it's his penis at all, it probably isn't, but the fact that someone's got it in a jar and they paid $3,000 for it, it's quite a weird thing.
I don't know. I'm.
Are you okay with buying penises?
I think I am actually.
All right.
Yeah. Well, if they belong to someone as historically famous as Napoleon, I wonder if it's almost it must be the whole sum of a body in its all various parts that you could put together as one ultimate character from history.
Like a Frankenstein of history.
So Napoleon's penis with the leg of, we must have legs that have survived.
Yeah, we had Sarah Bernhardt, the celebrity actress. She had her leg amputated. It became a celebrity leg.
There we go.
We went on tour.
Sarah Bernhardt's leg. We've got Napoleon's penis.
She played Napoleon's son, yeah.
Well, this is...
it's right in itself, isn't it?
If it can connect, we've got Einstein's brain.
Yeah, we do.
We've got someone's regrown Van Gogh's ear using some DNA, so we could actually use a scientifically...
Just whack one of them on.
Yeah, whack an ear on.
We can rebuild.
The ultimate
greatest
historical...
person from history.
Yeah.
God. Well, I mean, that was a low moment in the podcast. Let's raise the bar. Let's do some proper highbrow history. This is the part of the show where we do the nuance window.
The nuance window!
This is where we allow our expert historian to have 2 minutes to launch into their own thesis about what we should really think about and care about in this subject. So I'm going to get my little stopwatch up here, and without much further ado, you have 2 minutes, starting now.
Okay, so many Napoleonic biographies profess to bring us closer to the real Napoleon. You can read every one of his surviving letters. But I sometimes wonder about the futility of looking for the real Napoleon. After all, from the very beginning of his career, as we've heard, he's consciously sought to create his own myth. So where then does the myth end and the real man begin? Napoleon should be seen as a kind of modern celebrity figure, one who actively sought to shape his own image, persona and reputation. And we can see this in, for example, the story of the Battle of Arcole in 1796 during the Italian campaign, which we have heard about. It's at this point that we start to see the emergence of what Jean Toulard, French historian, one of the sort of great writers on Napoleon, has called the myth of the saviour figure that Napoleon used throughout his career. But what's interesting when we look at Arcole is how he altered the narrative a little bit. So there's a bridge, the Austrians are on one side, the French are on the other, and a soldier called Augereau, a general called Augereau, tries to cross the bridge waving one of the French standards. He is repelled, and Napoleon takes up the flag and repeated the action. Victory at Arcole was only secured a couple of days later by doing a sort of through the back door attack on the Austrians. But the popular image of Arcole is all about Napoleon. But the other side of that is the British take on it, which is the creation of what we would call the Black Legend, the character assassination that the British tried to conduct immediately as soon as Napoleon became a prominent figure. So this was an incredibly personalised series of attacks, unprecedented in terms of British criticism of the French. And this, I think, has created the lasting popular image of Napoleon in Britain. A small man with a big ego, a Corsican ogre by turns monstrous and ridiculous. Fake biographies accused him of nailing a dog to a door when he was a child, of poisoning some girlfriends, and of his mother being a whore. They even tried to kill him through some bombs in 1800. These were French bombs, but funded by Britain. And I would argue that this black myth still shapes the kind of professed revulsion, but simultaneous fascination towards Napoleon in this country. And I think he's an extremely important example of how the legacies of historical figures, whether we view them positively or negatively, are shaped by ideological forces.
Lovely, thank you. He's a pretty extraordinary character, isn't he? And we've only really done the first 30 years of his life.
Yeah, that's amazing. The thing that fascinates me, fanboying that he did, of following in the footsteps of, because I've been thinking about that a lot recently. You hear about people who want to become unique individuals, do their own thing, but actually, so if you take the Beatles, for example, and you look at the blatant obsession that the Gallagher brothers of Oasis had, they rose to the top by just trying to emulate the greatest formula of pop music, unashamedly, following in the footsteps completely. I never knew that he would be, I'm going to the places that Alexander went or Julius Caesar went. Yeah. And that's a side of him that I'd never thought about before. It seems fascinating, so that's what we need to do. All of us, just copy the greats.
Just do what they did. Edit out the bad stuff and do the good stuff.
But don't kill people en masse.
Don't go across the line.
Don't cross the line.
Don't pull a Napoleon.
All right, Dan, well, it's time now for your quiz. It's the end of the show. At the beginning of the show, we had the So What Do You Know, which is where we introduce some of the concepts. Now it's the So What Do You Know Now. So what do you know now? You get 60 seconds on the clock.
I've never won a quiz. Just
You work on a very famous podcast about knowledge, so you should hopefully have learned some stuff here, otherwise you might get fired. 10 questions, they're pretty straightforward, but let's see how much you remember. Starting now, where was Napoleon born?
Corsica.
Yes. What was Napoleon's wife called? One of her names.
Rose.
Yes,
Josephine.
or Josephine, yes. How much did a urologist pay for his item?
Oh, no, I don't know. $30,000.
$3,000.
$3,000.
What was Napoleon's nickname?
Le Petit man, the petite commander, the
corporal.
Corporal.
Yeah. What year did the French Revolution begin?
1789 and 19.
Yep. Which city, named after his boyhood hero?
Alexandria,
yep. How did he convince the French people of his genius while in Italy?
Posters.
Yes, posters and newspapers. What did Napoleon want to be when he grew up?
Fireman.
Sort of a great writer, really, but or a commander. Which monarch had his head chopped off in 1793?
Louis XVI.
That's right. And when did Napoleon become first consul of France?
In 1799.
Yes, bang on. Wow. I mean, that felt almost like a 10 out of 10. I'm going to give you 9.5 out of 10 because you...
I got the 3 right in the
got the
30,000,
3 right.
3,000.
Yeah. I'm
It's pretty good.
Oh my God.
Strong score.
Genuinely, heart is racing in a way it never has for a long time. Wow. That's a
fireman is a
victory.
cute answer.
What?
The fireman.
Oh, yeah.
What's it going to be when he
That's
grows up? Fireman. Lovely. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Napoleon, Dan.
Yeah.
It's been really great having you here. For now, I'm going to have to say a big thank you to my guests. In Comedy Corner, the fantastic Dan Schreiber from No Such Thing as Fish, and in History Corner, the fantastic Dr. Laura O'Brien from Northumbria University. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please do share it with your friends, leave a review online, and make sure to subscribe to You're Dead to Me so you never miss an episode. But for now, I'm going to have to say goodbye, or rather au revoir, or is it ciao? Nah, never mind. You're Dead to Me was a Muddy Knees media production for BBC Radio 4. The researcher was Emma Nagouse, and the producer was Dan Morelle.
Beyond Today is the daily podcast from Radio 4. It asks one big question about one big story in the news and beyond.
Just how big is Netflix?
Why are young people getting lost in the system?
I'm Tina Dahealy.
I'm Matthew Price.
And along with a team of curious producers, we are searching for answers that change the way we see the world.
I was actually quite shocked by how many people this issue affects.
So we're doing stories about technology, about identity,
Are you trying to look black?
No, I am not trying to look black.
power, where power lies, how it's changing.
And every weekday we speak to the smartest people in the BBC and beyond.
It's basically what I've been wanting to do since I was little. Just talk about business and economics.
And the stories started forming in my head.
That's what I've learned. It's okay to feel.
Subscribe to us on BBC Sounds.
And join in on the hashtag Beyond Today.